Welcome everyone to this webinar. A good morning to some of you and a good afternoon to others. Thank you all for joining today. We're really excited to see so many people online. This is the second webinar in a series of 2 about project design and fundraising that Girls Not Brides organized. These webinars are linked to a toolkit called Design for Success that we recently launched. And today we will be talking about the second part of that toolkit, which is specifically around fundraising for child marriage projects. We'll have 2 speakers today. Myself, my name is Lara van Koutrik and I am Partnership Manager in the partnership team. And I'm joined by my colleague Michelle Wissen, who is our Donor Engagement Officer and who knows a lot about engaging with donors and fundraising. So who is this webinar for? This webinar is for all Girls Not Brides members and other civil society organizations that want to learn more about fundraising, but it's also for organizations that are currently writing proposals or are looking to start proposals. We will be giving you some concrete tips around fundraising and also direct you to some resources that you can use which are available on the Girls Not Brides website. The webinar will be recorded, and after the webinar you can find the recording online on the Girls Not Brides website and on our YouTube channel. Throughout the webinar your microphone will be muted, so we won't be able to hear you, but if you have a question or if there is anything that limits you from participating or maybe you can't hear well, please write in the chat box and for questions write in the question box, and we will be able to answer them. There will be a question and answer sessions at the end of this webinar, so please hold your questions for now or type them in the question box throughout the webinar and we will answer them by the end of this webinar. So just to give you a brief overview of what we will be discussing today, we will give you a quick reminder about the toolkits. For those of you who joined last week's webinar, this will be similar as what we discussed last week, but it's just a quick update on what this toolkit is about. Then we will be talking a bit about how you can identify potential donors. We will be giving you some tips on how to write strong proposals and how to apply for funding opportunities. Then we will be talking about managing and building donor relations. And at the end, we'll guide you to some useful resources that can help you further in your fundraising. And like I said, at the end of the webinar, there will be time for questions from your side. So about this toolkit. The Design for Success Toolkit was written by Girls Not Brides with support from over 100 Girls Not Brides members to improve your skills in project design and fundraising. Like I said, over 100 Girls Not Brides members inputted into the toolkit from all around the world. The toolkit is divided in 2 parts. The first part is a step-by-step guide that will take you through the process of planning well-structured projects that address child marriage. We have discussed this part of the toolkit in last week's webinar. The second part of the toolkit gives you tips on how to turn your project into a strong proposal and provide some detailed guidance on fundraising. Throughout the toolkit, we are talking about child marriage projects, but we acknowledge that these projects can include a wide range of topics, including issues of health and education, for example. So how will this toolkit help you? The first part of the toolkit will help you to design strong projects, which hopefully will result in great projects as well. First of all, we know that project relevance is vital to success, and this toolkit will help you develop projects that directly meet the needs of girls and young women. It will also help you to design your project in a very structured way, including developing clear budgets and work plans. And the toolkit guides you through a very detailed process of developing your own project. But also by using the toolkit, once the project is running, you will be able to monitor and evaluate the impact of your project and make corrections if needed. The second part of the toolkit focuses on fundraising. And we know that clear proposals mean higher success in fundraising. So by using this toolkit, you will be able to understand what donors are looking for and how to develop stronger funding proposals. You will be able to develop clear proposals that are based on a strong analysis, which will help you to increase your credibility among potential donors. And throughout the toolkit, we are providing you with tips which will make you understand how to meet donor requirements and how to strengthen donor relations. So like I said, this part of the webinar will focus specifically on fundraising. So we know that funding for your project can come from a wide range of sources. For example, a formal grant with an international government agency or a private foundation, maybe from a donation from a philanthropist, or even funding mobilized through crowdfunding or an online appeal. But whatever method you are using, you always need to make sure that your organization's time and resources are being well spent on fundraising activities and that you're likely to be successful. So hopefully this toolkit and this webinar will help you to decide how to spend your fundraising time to increase your chances for successful fundraising.
Great, thanks Lara. So it's Michelle here. I'm going to just speak a bit to start us off around identifying and researching prospective donors. So as we've just heard from Lara, we need to think about lots of different sources of funding and make sure that we are aware of all the different opportunities that are out there and the different types of funders who might be relevant to our organisation. But also when we're identifying prospective donors specifically for child marriage projects, we need to remember that so many different types of donors are interested in child marriage from different sectors. So from child protection perspective or education perspective, health perspective, human rights or humanitarian settings. And so, whether you are a health organisation or an education organisation working on this issue, make sure that you're looking at a really wide range of donors because you and your project might be relevant to their funding and there may be some unusual suspects. When you're looking for identifying prospective donors, there are some tools out there that you can help to speed up this process and to give you some start points. So on our website, we've got a funding guide that we'll just show you where it is. It's under our resources page on our website, and under resources we have a fundraising section. So we have a page of where to get funding, and this is not an exhaustive list, but it can be a really good starting point for some tools. We've grouped them by the different sources of funding. So, there's crowdfunding, there's UN agencies, government agencies, embassies, foundations, etc. And it's just a really good starting point to see organizations, donor organizations who have child marriage, women and girls, and related issues. And there are some other organisations out there that also have lists around women's and girls and various topics. So definitely have a look for those lists out there that can help you start thinking about donors working in the right space for your project. So next we thought we'd just launch a quick poll. So it should be coming up for everyone. You can press to see press to add whether you've received funding for your child marriage work before. So we'll just give you 30 seconds just to respond. Have you received funding for your child marriage work before? Yes or no? just so we have a sense of, you know, who's attending and whether everyone is already receiving lots of funding and looking for more, or whether they're quite new to funding for specific child marriage projects. Great. Okay, so the poll results show it's just under half have received funding for child marriage and 54% haven't. So a mixture on the webinar, which is really interesting to see, and hopefully there'll be tips for all of you that will be helpful as we move along. So the next thing we wanted to talk about was, you know, once you've identified some good donors you think might be useful for your work, might have some good funding opportunities, how do you research them? And good research is really, really vital. And it's vital because it helps you devote your time and resources to the right donors, so you know that you're eligible, this is a good opportunity for you. And secondly, it's really vital when you come to pitch your project, if you can do it in a way that that donors know it's really suiting, you know, their goals, their strategy, then that's really going to up your chances of success. So the ideal donor, they're going to have values, priorities and approaches that really align with your work. And we've listed a few things on the PowerPoint that are good to look out for. And these include, you know, vision and mission. So there's really high level value donor. Does your work also speak to those? And then, you know, donors also tend to give their geographic and thematic priorities. And that's going to help you understand if their funding is eligible to you. And then, you know, on top of that really basic kind of website information that donors often make publicly available, they also sometimes have documents you can download, maybe around, you know, their strategy, their policy, around certain areas of their work, etc. If you can get to know those documents, they can be handy resources when you come to explaining your work and how it fits in with their current work, what they're planning to do, how you're really part of their vision for what they want to achieve. And I also find that when I'm looking for donors and looking to see who's interested in child marriage work, that it's really handy to look at other things that they've funded. So if donors have funded organisations that are similar to yours, maybe similar size, similar outlook, then maybe they're really open to your type of work and a good fit. And finally, we've added in this point about where is their funding coming from. And that's just to say that, you know, some donors you might want to do, there might be reasons why you shouldn't partner with them. And you need to just check that you understand where their funding is coming from and whether there are any reputational risks to your organisation of partnering with them. This may be quite rare, but it's really important that you understand the donor going to be perceived by others if you do get funding with them and move forward with a partnership with them. So the final slide in this bit is just around assessing a call for proposals. So where you've seen a really good opportunity, you started reading into it, and you're trying to work out, is this worth my time? Should I put forward a proposal for this opportunity? Now, donors have lots of funding opportunities, and just because you fit with their vision, with their mission, with their high-level strategy, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to fit with that specific call for proposals. So in the toolkits that Laura's been discussing, we have a checklist that you can use to assess the funding opportunity. And this includes questions like are on the PowerPoint at the moment. You know, does our organisation meet all of the eligibility requirements? Does our project fit with the priorities and objectives of this specific call for proposals? And are there other documents that are required that we can't submit or that we can? And this checklist can really help to make sure that you're just spending the time on the right proposals, and we hope will be a really useful tool for you. So I'm just going to hand back to Laura now for the next section.
Thank you, Michelle. So we're now going to talk about some tips when you're applying for funding opportunities. And all of these tips you can find in the toolkit itself as well. So first of all, when you do write an application to a donor, make sure that every proposal you write is tailored towards that donor. So every proposal should be adapted for the specific donor that you're sharing your proposal with. Don't be tempted to send the same brief of your project to different donors without taking into consideration their donor priorities. Ensure you understand all of the priorities mentioned in the call for proposals, and also, if applicable, see if you can find out the scoring criteria for the proposal. And then brainstorm on how your project is relevant for each of these priorities, and make sure you mention that explicitly in the proposal. And don't be afraid to follow up with the donor if anything is unclear. It's always a good idea also to make broad reference to the donor's priorities in your application when relevant. Secondly, it's really important that you always follow the guidelines of the donor step by step. So make sure you adhere to the format and requirements to ensure your application is not rejected before it's even read. And make sure you understand these requirements and formats really well before you start. And when you start your proposal, make a checklist of all the points that you must remember and check them off as you prepare your proposal to make sure you're not forgetting anything and to really check that you've answered all the questions and all the requirements. And don't forget the really small issues like the administrative steps, such as, for example, the space limit that you're allowed to use for each section, or the exact words that you need to include in the title line of your submission email. It's really those small things that are often coming at the last moment that can be really important and that can jeopardize your chances of getting funding if you don't get them right. And when you develop a proposal, you may need input from different people of your team. And to ensure you submit your proposal on time, it can be helpful to hold a planning meeting with all the people that are contributing to the proposal at the start of the process. And in this meeting, you should really look at establishing a timeline and defining the different roles and responsibility of each of your team members. So make sure there is enough time for reviewing and checking all parts of your application and for people to submit or answer to their different roles in the writing process. Thirdly, it's really important to give a strong impression of your organization. Donors are not just interested in funding your project, but they're really investing in your capacity to deliver that project. So it's really essential that you're able to communicate your strengths and that you're able to show that you're doing good work that is making a difference, that you use your funds effectively, and that your organization is well governed and well managed. As this gives you credibility with the donor and makes them more likely to be willing to invest in you. But you should also think about what makes your organization unique, as there might be many similar organizations applying for similar funding. So what makes your organization really stand out from other competing organizations? And really emphasize those points in your application. Also, the most convincing applications always reference to the organization's track record or previous successes and learning. And by doing so, you will give the donor confidence that you are the right organization to run this project. So for example, share highlights from previous projects, including the impact you had on supporting women and girls, but also share how you have experience in managing funds of a similar size, because your donor would want to know that you're able to deliver on what you set out to do. And make sure you don't leave writing your organization's profile to the last moment. Really invest sufficient time in this. So a good organization profile also includes information on, for example, your mission and vision, your governance structure, and explaining how decisions are made in your organization, some information about the technical expertise of and skills of your staff, information about your financial system to show them that you're able to manage funds well, and also information on your M&E systems and showing the donor how you monitor your work, but also how you learn from it, and showing that you are a reflective organization that learns from previous successes, but also from things that maybe didn't go well in the past. Fourthly, it's really important that you pitch your project convincingly. So if you have a look at the toolkit and you've used the toolkit when designing your project, you will already have done most of the hard work. If you haven't done so, please make sure you have a look at the toolkit, and specifically the first part of the toolkit, before you start writing your proposal. It's really important that you show that you fully understand the problem and the issue that your project is aiming to address. So use the information that came out of your situation and problem analysis. And we discussed the situation and problem analysis in last week's webinar. And inform the donor what the results of that situation and problem analysis were. But also outline the process that you undertook to get those results. And be sure to let the donor know that this was a participatory process which involved key stakeholders, particularly girls themselves. In doing so, it will really give credibility to your arguments, and your donor will be convinced that you really know what is going on in the community that you want to work in, and that you understand the problem that your project is trying to address. Then also clearly outline why your project has a strong and appropriate response to the problem you identified. So match your activities to the different drivers of the problem, and provide explicit examples of how learning from the analysis has been incorporated into the project design. So show them that you don't only understand what the problem is, but that you've also thought clearly about what the potential solutions are. So for example, if in your situation analysis you identified that adolescent girls have poor knowledge of their health and rights, you may outline how your project is going to address that, and what strategies you have designed to mitigate that problem. Also make sure that you have a strong understanding of the work and actors of other programs which already exist addressing a similar problem. For example, clearly demonstrate how your project will work in harmony with these rather than replicate them. Because your donor doesn't want to fund a project that is already being done by other people in the same area. So they really want to see that you have thought through all the elements of your project, and that you are aware of what's already happening on the issue you're trying to address, and that you already know what other people are doing as well. And that you've really tried to add value to what has already been done, instead of replicating a similar project or a similar strategy. Also clearly explain how your project's activities will affect change for your target groups. So really focus on how you will achieve that change. Hopefully, each of your activities will lead to a specific output or outcome. And maybe you believe that the combination of your different project activities will lead towards a specific goal. But whatever your project logic is, make sure that you give the logic in detail and as much clarity as you can. So maybe the solutions that you're suggesting are very logic to you, but not to anyone outside of the project. So using tools like a log frame, which we discussed in last week's webinar and which you can find in the toolkit, will help the donor to understand how you will have an impact and make sure that your project appears more professional. And when you're developing your proposal, it's always important not to be too over-ambitious. So be realistic about what your project can achieve and the timeline for achieving this change. If you're not convinced yourself that you'll be able to achieve something within the timeline, it is unlikely that the donor will be convinced either. So remember that addressing child marriage is a long-term process. And don't be tempted to be over-ambitious or over-promise on what can be achieved in a short time frame. We know that in, for example, a year or 2 years or 3 years, you might not be able to solve the whole issue you've identified, but at least clearly outline what part of the solution you can address with the project and how that will contribute to long-term change in the long run. So these were some top tips on writing your proposal and making sure you build convincing donor proposals. But another important part of fundraising is to have strong relations with potential or existing donors. So in the second half of this webinar, we will talk a bit more about relation building with donors. But before we do that, we just want to know from you, who are your donors currently? So we're going to launch another poll and you will see a list of different types of donors. So please tick the donors that you are currently receiving funding from. And you can tick more than one box. If you're not receiving any funding, you can also just not tick any of the boxes. So here is the poll. I'm going to give you 30 seconds to respond. So please tick the boxes that are relevant for your organization. Thank you very much for filling in that poll. So really surprisingly, I can see that a lot of you are actually getting your funding from local funding institutions. And that's really great to see because I think that means that you've been very successful in building relations with donors that are very close to you. But less of you have been receiving funding from multilateral agencies like UNICEF or UNFPA, or maybe embassies or bilateral donors. So hopefully the next section will give you some tips on how you can build relations with new potential donors, including donors like this.
Great. So when it comes to building relations with donors, think about this very broadly and know that this relates to donors, that we need to think about relations with donors, both with potential donors and with those that we're already working with. So as that first point says on this slide, fundraising is so much more than proposal writing. And in some cases, a proposal you submit might be your way of getting on the agenda of a new donor. But in other cases, that might be the last step after much engagement with donors, and the proposal might just be the formal part of the process. You've already set yourself up really well to get that funding. So we always need to think about the importance of meeting donors and of getting them really interested in our work, not just of trying to apply cold for everything, because we really miss out on some great opportunities through just looking to apply. And it's really important that you appreciate that you never know who might fund you. So if you meet donors and you think, oh, they're not particularly interested in what I'm doing exactly, it doesn't mean that they might not change their strategy or their focus in the future. So it's really important to get donors on sides from all different angles, and to know that they can also be speaking about you and may be important allies. So donors who speak to other donors about your work can put you in a really good position to hear from them, and they might also think about funding you in the future. And with your current projects, you should hope to have, funding renewals from them, and really try and make sure that can happen. So we've always got to be on our toes about keeping donors interested and aware of what we're doing. A really key tip that I would say around building relations with donors is to be careful with your approach and to be sensitive. So Lara, if we can just go back on that slide. One of the things we know is that there's not one approach to building relations with donors, and that some of them really like to hear from organisations all the time, and some of them want to have a more kind of step back relationship with their grantees and potential grantees, and they might even have guidelines around how they interact with you. So be really sensitive, see how donors are responding when you reach out to them, and make sure anything you have on how a donor likes to engage is passed around with other staff, and that everyone is on the same page. Everyone knows who are the donors that we want to keep on sharing updates with, and who are the donors that we just need to make sure our executive director reaches out to once a year or something. Donors are very busy, and you're going to be best when you tailor your approach. The final point I would just say on this is that you really need to be careful that you build their interest first and you then move on to the funding conversation. So make sure that you are telling them about your organisation, making sure that your priorities seem really relevant to them, and then introduce the funding ask, and then talk about your funding gaps and how you think that funding from them could be really formative or important. But really start with building a relationship based on two organisations interested in the same cause and the same social change. So now we've got 5 very practical tips that if you aren't doing now, you can really start working on and try and build the capacity in your team to do these things. So the first one is just outreach. We're saying, be active in your outreach. Once you've done research on donors and you've seen donors you think you might have a good chance of getting funding from, see how you can connect with them, and whether you can email them or meet them at an event, or if you think you might be likely to come across them at a certain occasion, try and make sure that happens. And at a very practical level, make sure that you're collecting information on them. So follow them on social media, subscribe to their newsletters, visit their websites, so that if they launch a new strategy, you can read it, you can reference it, you can make sure that you seem like you're really on top of their work. And also use other broader sites to find out about opportunities that are coming up. So use us, use Girls Not Brides as a resource, and definitely click on our fundraising page, at regular intervals, or see in our newsletters to find, as Lara is showing you now, just some very top line kind of briefs on funding opportunities that might be really relevant for you. And this is once again on our site under fundraising and resource. So please use this and make sure that it's really helpful for you. The next tip is around networking. So find opportunities for your staff to network in person with donor representatives. In-person connections are so helpful because they can really make sure that you're remembered. And when you're at conferences, meetings or events, reach out to donors and connect there. And if you are going to any event and you can, for example, see the attendee list in advance, then that's a real opportunity to try and understand who's going to be there in the room and who it might be a great idea for you to try and connect with. When you're meeting with people in this kind of informal networking way, try and learn about their work, tell them about yours, exchange business cards and start connecting, and really build your network. Speak to donors about other donors, speak to other organisations you're working with about their donors, and just share and learn and build your information and your internal knowledge base on donors. The next one is meetings. So where it's appropriate, and you can only yourself where it's appropriate, you can request a meeting with a donor to try and further relations, to try and maybe put a funding ask on the table or just make sure they know more about you. But as we said earlier, it's really important that you start with them learning about your organisation and becoming really excited about your work before you move on to talking about funding. So just, never go into a meeting starting with saying, we want a grant of this, when what you need to do is say, this is what we're really excited about, this is our strategy, and it really fits in with what you're doing. Of course, you can have frank conversations about funding gaps, and the funding you've secured, what you want to do, but just make sure that interest, that buy is there first. The next tip that we have is around being prepared. And I'm sure this is something that you're all doing, but when you are meeting with, for example, local donors who are really supportive of your work, you have to make sure that you've done your research and that you can speak to them about their own objectives and priorities. And it seems as if you're interested in them and you're not just seeing them as a checkbook. So consider ways in which your work will contribute to their success and speak to them about this. And one thing that I would always say to make sure you do is just, carry on those conversation chains after meetings and make sure that you follow up with them with an email to thank them for the opportunity, or if you've mentioned any other documents or ideas in the meeting, make sure that you share that with them straight away so that you can keep progressing while everything is current and while they really remember you and what you were trying to discuss with them. Finally, our final tip in building relations is just visibility. So make sure your organisation is donors through social media, through reports about your project, through your website, so through any way that a donor may search for you or that you may contact them, with the information. And when you are updating your website and when you are updating your social media, just remember that donors might be looking. So if you can make sure that you're presenting the most professional and very kind of up-to-date view of yourself and your work, then that would be really fantastic in helping them to get an idea that you might be someone they want to invest in. And it's really important that you know as well that they are searching you and that they are talking to other people about you. So keep this in mind, and that's a really good tip to success, that you have documents and visuals out there that they will really enjoy looking at.
Thank you, Michelle. So these were some concrete tips on how to build relations with potential donors or donors that might not know you yet. But you might already receive funding from existing donors. So we're now going to give you some tips on how you can make sure you engage with those existing donors. First of all, maintain good relationships that you have with donors. So once you have been successful in getting funding from a donor, it's really important that you maintain good relationships with that donor. So make sure your staff are responsive, consistent, and professional in any correspondence that they have with the donor. And make sure you meet all your contract obligations and accountability requirements. So this means submitting all donor reports on time and make sure they're fully completed and well written. And again, small things make a big difference here. So even things like spelling mistakes or not well-written emails can really damage the relationship you have with that donor. So always pay extra attention when you write to a donor or when you submit any documents to a donor, as you want to show them that you're a professional organization and that you really take your relationship with them seriously. Secondly, make sure you always stay in touch and engage with them so that even after you've received the grant, they don't lose sight of what you are doing and really keep you as an organization on top of their mind. So stay in touch with your donors and engage them on your work. And you can use milestones such as a project launch or the publication of a certain piece of research or maybe the completion of an evaluation that you did. And you can invite your donors or potential donors even to attend these events and engage with them. This will really help to feel them more actively involved in your work. And it also gives you an opportunity to show them what you're doing, why you are good, and why you're doing what you're doing. And this is really important to donors, as donors often view the organizations that they're funding as their connection to what they call the grassroots or the people on the ground. So it's really important that you share with them your activities and your successes in your project. And make sure that you're also learning from what you're doing. And for example, by sharing your research or your learnings, you can also show them what learning you have, but also make yourself a vital resource for their learning. As for many donors, they depend on grantees and whatever work they are doing to learn as well and to decide on whether or not they should continue funding the way that they are or maybe change their funding priorities. And again, visibility is important. So think of documents that you can share with donors throughout the project period. For example, annual reports. If possible, if you have the capacity and resources to do it, you might consider preparing and distributing an annual report for your organization. And this report will show the impact that you're having beyond the one project that your donor is funding. And you can include your achievements, maybe some case studies, but also your audited financial reports, a list of your staff and board, and also your sources of financial support for each year. And this will be really a useful tool for donors to see what you're doing as a broader organization and to really understand what is happening within your organization. But it's also an opportunity to show your work and impact. And maybe you have had really good successes in other projects that your donor is not necessarily funding, but showing that impact can benefit that one donor as well, and they might become interested in other aspects of your work as well. And you can also consider preparing, for example, a regular newsletter that you can share with donors and other people that are interested. And this is something that you can update and share more regularly throughout the project periods, and helps your donor to really understand more about your project and how your organization is contributing to the change you want to achieve. So these were some really concrete tips. But there is a lot more information in the Design for Success Toolkit and some detailed guidance on building and maintaining relationships with donors. So we would really like to encourage you to download the toolkit and use it whenever you're writing proposals or whenever you're interacting with donors. But next to this toolkit, there are some other resources that can be useful in your funding as well. So I'm just going to show you a couple of resources that you can find on the Girls Not Brides website. And the first one we've been showing you before, and this is what we call our fundraising page, which we recently launched in August this year. And this is a dedicated page on the Girls Not Brides website that is only looking at fundraising and really helps you to A, find out where you can get funding, but also B, how you can improve chances of securing funding. So even if you haven't done so yet, please have a look at this webpage, and you can find it at girlsnotbrides.org/fundraising. And if you go onto that fundraising page, you can also click through to other resources, including some blogs. And I just want to show you a blog that was written by one of the donors that is funding a lot of child marriage work, called Amplify Change. They recently wrote a blog on our website with some tips for writing applications to them based on the learning that they have had from funding child marriage projects before. So there's some really concrete tips here on how you can make sure you're successful in your fundraising and proposal writing. But on the website, you can also find experience from other Girls Not Brides members. And a really great example that we have on our website is from our Kenyan member, Nigay. And again, they wrote a blog on the Girls Not Brides website about how they successfully mobilized funding through crowdfunding. And it can give you some concrete examples of how other organizations have gone about their fundraising, why they were successful, and what their learning is. So like I said, please visit the Girls Not Brides website and specifically the fundraising page, as you will find these blogs, but also many more other resources that can help you. So we now have time for some questions. I'm sure some of you might have some burning questions that you want to ask us. If you have a question, please write your question in the questions box that you can find on the webinar, GoToWebinar panel. We're just going to give everybody a minute to write their questions, and then we will start answering them. So please note that we won't be able to hear you as your microphone is muted. So if you have a question, write it in the questions box that you can see on the GoToWebinar panel. So it seems like nobody's having a question, which could either mean we have given you a very clear presentation, or it means you've all fallen asleep. But I hope it's the first one. So if there are no further questions, all that's left is to thank you for your participation today. Like we said at the beginning, a recording of this webinar you can find it on our website after the webinar. We've got one question that came in, so we're gonna try to answer it. And it's a really good question. What should you keep in mind when designing a fundraising strategy? And do we have any tips for that specifically? And Michelle, are you able to give some tips on developing a fundraising strategy and what key issues to keep in mind?
Yes, sure. So I think with a fundraising strategy, the first step is to really understand what your organization wants to achieve and the budget you need for that, and to basically be able to say, this is the amount that we need for our project or for this year or whatever your kind of your scope, and then say this is how much secure funding we have and this is what we need. Once you've identified that gap, then you can start to, what I would do is start to look for donors that you can then put into a pipeline. And this pipeline would be saying, here are a list of donors that we think might be interested. And then you're going to watch them, you're going to make actions as a staff team to try and get those donors moving from people that we're interested in, we think might be good donors, to someone who can fund us. So first of all, you need to do research on those donors, and then you need to see if you can cultivate relationships with them. If you can cultivate relationships with them, then, or if they have explicit funding opportunities you can apply for, then you need to apply. And once you've applied or you've furthered your relations, you then need to try and get into negotiations around funding. But the idea is that you have a really clear idea as an organisation of what you need to achieve your goals, and then you can use that in your communication with them and start to plot donors on a kind of map where one side is research and the other side is a contract, and trying to move the donors along that line through building relationships with them, through applying. And you're never going to get all those donors. There'll always be, there's lots of prospects that won't be successful when you're fundraising, but it's about making sure you've done enough research, that you're putting your time into the right ones, and that some of it is working and some of it is coming back. And it can often snowball, and I really like, once you have good donor relationships, often they can talk to other donors, or they can help you present yourself to other donors. So yeah, really understand what you need and then try and move donors from research to contract.
Thank you, Michelle. I hope that answered that question. Another question that came in is, we mentioned that we can invite donors to a launch of a project, for example, but how is that possible if your event is taking place at a remote location? So we really understand that might be a challenge that you're facing when you're implementing your project, and especially when you work with donors who are based overseas. However, I think it can never harm to send your donor an invitation anyway, even if you know that they might not be able to attend. But also sometimes donors do come and visit the countries that they're funding projects in. So if you know that your donor is visiting the country that you're based in, always be open to receiving them at your office, and even think about whether or not you can take them to see any of the project locations that you're implementing your projects in. And also sometimes it could help if they were not able to attend themselves, to just share a short report or maybe some pictures of the launch or the event that you have done. So really try to think of ways to engage them, even though they might not be physically able to attend. And also consider sending out invitations, even though the likelihood of them attending is small. It will still make sure that they are aware of what is happening in your project. And if they're really interested, they might even consider sending somebody from an office nearby, or request you to send pictures and the results of your project launch. Then another question that came in is, can we have the link to access the webinar again? So like I said, the webinar has been recorded. So after the webinar, and hopefully by the beginning of next week, we are going to upload the recording of both this webinar and the webinar of last week to our Girls Not Brides website. So you can find it under girlsnotbrides.org/events, and then you can click through to webinars. And they will also be available on our YouTube channel. So if you go to YouTube and just search for Girls Not Brides, you can find our YouTube channel, and the webinars recording should be uploaded there in the coming days as well. We've got one last question that came in, which is about approaching a donor within a short period of time after one successful project where the outcome is yet to be observed. So how is it possible to share experience to the current donor? The donor might not believe what we did because we can't share the project outcome. I think this is a very valid question, because often it takes time for you to really be able to demonstrate the results of your project. So if you can't demonstrate any long-term results or long-term impact, try to focus on the shorter-term results that you have had. So if you've already done some activities, show them which activities you've done, and maybe try to get some feedback from the people who participated in your activities. So for example, if you've been training girls, try to see if you can get some quotes from the girls on whether or not your training was successful and whether or not it has helped them. So really try to gather evidence or documents that will show that you have been implementing something. And although you might not have an evaluation yet, or you might not have a final report of your project yet, at least you will have some intermediary steps that you're able to show to the donor. And like I said before, things like pictures or videos or stories of girls or people that participated in your project always work very well with donors, as that really shows them that you are having an impact on the people that you're working with. Michelle, do you have anything to add to the questions that came in?
I think that was a very detailed response, Laura, and I agree with your points there about making you can try and use other tools, so like quotes or more qualitative responses or feedback from those that your project is really having an impact on. The other thing that you might be able to use in terms of relaying how great your project was to donors while you're still waiting on the kind of formal results, so when you're still working through that result process, it's just, I think, to give them an assessment as an organisation of what you think's shifted in that project and how what you would look to do in a next project. So if you can say that you're working in a community and something you've done has had this effect, and we're going to prove that, we're hoping to have more data to show you soon, but we think that this means that the next step would be something different or something in the context has changed. It's basically starting to use some of those skills that you were building in project design, looking at the analysis or talking to people about how to design a project. What you're trying to say to the donor is, because we think achieved something in the first project, we now would tweak this because that didn't work well, and we think we can do it better, or it did work well but we want to add this. And also we think something's changed, and because something's changed we can now do the next step. So it's just positioning the project that something is achieved, and yes, the hard data will come later, but you're positioning that you've had success and that you've learned from the project, and that's why you're looking forward in a slightly different way.
Great, thanks Michelle. So we had another question coming in about can we have a specific webinar to build the capacity of our staff in fundraising? So I think what would be really useful is for you to share the toolkit with your staff. The toolkit has some really concrete step-by-step guidelines and tools that they can use. So I think as a first step, the toolkit will be very, very useful for any staff in a fundraising department. Also, you can share the recordings of this webinar, which I said will be online in the coming days. And of course, if there are any outstanding questions or issues that you need an answer to, you're always free to ask us and send us an email. But also, again, have a look at the resource center and the funding page, as there are many different tools and toolkits uploaded on there as well that could be useful for staff. So I think that was the last question. Thank you all so much for participating in this webinar and also for your questions, because that has been really helpful. I hope this webinar was helpful to you. And we want to thank you very much for your attention. Like I said, if you haven't downloaded the toolkit yet, please feel free to download it. We will be sending you an email after this webinar, which has the link to the toolkit in it as well. Also, if you enjoyed this webinar or you would like to continue the conversation on fundraising, please feel free to post on Twitter or Facebook. You can find our Twitter handle here, which is just Girls Not Brides, or follow Girls Not Brides on Facebook. And if you would like to give us any feedback on the webinar, please feel free to tweet us or send us a message on Facebook as well. For any other questions or any outstanding issues, feel free to drop us an email at info@girlsnotbrides.org. And we hope to see you again in any of the upcoming webinars that we might plan later on this year. So thanks again for your attention, and I hope all of you have a good rest of this Friday and a really nice weekend ahead. Thank you.